Judeo-Christian Islamic culture group, as well as the Byzantine and the Persian group. He clusters those in between, so that the dates he gives here are 1000 BC to 0, 0 to 1000 AD, 1000 AD to 2000. Now this 1,000 year thing doesn't work very well when you look at the cultures of the Far East, India and China, because their creative period, if you want to be fair about it, really extends from 1500 BC to 1500 AD. They've got about a 3,000 year creative arc before they're wiped out. In the case of India, the Muslims come in, but they're already decaying anyway. Well, we won't get into that. So we have the Greco-Roman culture, and their primary symbol is the body. The primary symbol of Faustian culture is infinite space. And then the primary symbol for the Magians is the world as cavern. So now this thing about the Greeks is, with respect to the body, every aspect of Greek culture is based on a kind of extension or obsession with the physical body. The Greeks were absolutely terrified of anything that suggested infinity, infinite horizons, or anything far or distant. They really liked staying close to the body. There's this kind of emphasis on the opposition between form and matter. According to Aristotle, the soul is the form of the body. Sounds like a somewhat strange statement to us. And the polis, the city-state, which is the primary political organization of the Greco-Roman culture. The city-state as polis is something that's visible. If you stand up on a hill, the highest point in the city, you can see the entire city. It's kept very carefully within visibility. The nation-state, on the other hand, is something that, as you know, is far too large to see from any one perspective point. And the cavern, the political organization in the Magian culture, is what he calls the consensus. This consensus is not necessarily geographically bound, the way the Greco-Romans were very careful to have their idea politically bound to a specific geography. The nation-state is also bound to geography, although a very large geography, but the consensus is not. The societies within the Magian civilization, whether you're talking about the Jewish group or the Zoroastrians, are all held together by common belief. There must be a consensus. And moreover, there's a sort of possession of a sacred text, and that consensus is a reflection of that sacred text, because the idea is that truth descends down from the Spirit, descends down and inhabits all of us, and when someone utters something that is true that everyone agrees on, they agree on it because it's rooted in the Spirit, and the Spirit can never lie. So truth doesn't come from the individual ego within these cultures. It comes from God. It is truth in that sense. So consistent with this, each culture has a different idea of the way in which destiny works. In the Greek system, destiny is called moira, and true to the physical, bodily nature of the Greco-Roman culture, moira actually has reference to a spatial boundary, such that when one god oversteps one boundary, moira is something that the god is subject to. And moira is sort of this thing that's immanent in the cosmos, and even the gods are subject to it. The gods, as well as the heroes, are equally subject to moira, to this necessity that pays back injustices with injustices. And then we have the central destiny idea in the Magian culture is Kismet, is the Arabic version of it, which is that destiny comes from God. That's the single soul source. Here the gods are subordinate to an immanent destiny. And in the Faustian culture, the individual destiny is this word called weird. In Shakespeare, it's still spelled, W-E-I-R-D. The Weird Sisters in Macbeth are a late echo of. But it's first articulated in Beowulf, when Beowulf goes out to meet his weird, his destiny, where he goes out to do battle with the dragon, which kills him, and he also kills the dragon. They sort of mutually wipe each other out. But here the idea is destiny unfolds from within the individual, so that you can see that the Jungian theory of destiny unfolding from within the self is rooted in this. In fact, the original word for the individuation process was Menschwerdung, and Werdung, or Werden rather, is the German word for to become, and it's derived from this weird Werden, Menschwerdung, the becoming of an individual. So Jung is coming out of this Faustian destiny idea, that destiny unfolds from within, and the sort of primary characters, you have Oedipus over here personifying this fate that is inflicted upon him. And then Job is the sort of primary character here, who also has to submit to a fate that comes directly from God. And then the characters of the Faustian culture, you can sort of begin with Parzival as the Grail quester, Faust, Hamlet. They're all characters. Spangler says that the characters of Northern European literature are the loneliest characters in the history of literature. Whether we're thinking of Hamlet brooding about his fate, or Wotan and Wagner's Ring Cycle brooding about this cosmic cycle that he can do nothing to stop, or whether we think of Parzival's lonely journeys through these dark, gloomy Nordic forests in quest of the Grail, or Faust's lonely quest for the infinite moment, or Ahab's quest to kill the whale. These are lonely individuals, but they're consistent with this Faustian destiny idea. I mean, this actually continues right on into our cinema. You have the sort of Godfather films with Michael Corleone working out his destiny. And now, in terms of the mathematics, each culture develops its own mathematics here. Euclidean geometry is a geometry of magnitudes, static magnitudes, very sensuous, very much a geometry of physicality. Magian is the algebra, where you have these mysterious x's and y's, these magical substance properties. In many ways, the Magian culture, as we'll see with Gebser tomorrow, and its retrieval of the cavern world, is a kind of regression to this earlier magical structure of consciousness, in which you have these mysterious substances at work in the world, and the algebra is a reflection of this. Their primary science, for example, is alchemy, and the Arabs really brought that to perfection. And over here we have statics, and the primary mathematic in the Faustian is the infinitesimal calculus. A feeling for no Greek could ever, no matter how they twisted and turned the way that they thought, could ever have come up with the calculus. Because the soul of the Greek civilization was such that infinity was terrifying to them. This is why the Copernican hypothesis, this is the real reason why, when Aristarchus first proposed this heliocentric hypothesis, it was discarded. It was inconsistent with what the soul of Greek civilization wanted. A closed, bounded universe. Something very sensuous, a sort of gigantic sculpture. And the primary art form for the Greeks is sculpture. They brought it to a perfection that no one else really ever has. And the primary art form for the Magian is this arabesque style that the Arabs brought to consummate perfection, these geometrical patterns. And the primary art form is classical music for our civilization. Classical music is something quite unique because it's based on polyphony, and polyphony gives you a sense of the infinite through sound. You have this sort of, one chorus begins the line here, and the next group starts the same line halfway through, and you go down, and you get this sense of polyphony. Originally, the church didn't like polyphony because you couldn't hear the words of the Mass, because they overlap with each other as they go through this polyphonic. But what that is the equivalent within music of the discovery of depth perspective in painting. And that depth perspective is the sense of the Faustian quest out into infinite space, breaking out of this closed-in cavern and going out into infinite space. From the Gothic cathedrals to the rockets that we sent to the moon, there is a consistency of world feeling here in Northern European and American civilization, this quest for infinite space. the sort of movement from the Romanesque arches in the Romanesque cathedrals to the Gothic arches, which suddenly bring in this vertical upthrust. You remember the cupola of the Russian Orthodox churches are onion-shaped. They deny that upthrust. From that is the breaking open of this Magian cavern, just blowing off the sort of ceiling of the universe and stepping out into infinite space. We have been obsessed with this infinite space and this idea of a lonely ego out here in the center of infinite space radiating off in all directions is the sort of primary idea that has motivated Northern European civilization. Even the articulation of the first law of physics, that an object will remain in motion forever unless it's stopped by an external force, is the same idea. For the Greeks, an object would remain in motion only so long as it was in contact with something pushing it. You imagine the shopping cart, the Greek would say, the shopping cart will go until I stop pushing it, and then it just rolls to a stop. Well, the Faustian will come in and say, well, what if you just sort of grease the road and you eliminate friction, give the shopping cart a push, and it'll go a hell of a lot further, won't it? What if we eliminate all? It'll just sail off to infinity. And that starts, with Buridan's impetus theory, the idea that you don't need angels turning the spheres when you have this idea of God kicking the spheres in a frictionless space that sets them in motion forever. So this idea, this has been our primary obsession, this fascination with infinity that has given birth to everything that has poured itself forth out of Faustian civilization. And it's exactly opposite to this Greco-Roman idea of the world as a beautiful little work of art. This classical temple where everything's elegant and quaint and closed in, this sort of the Parthenon with this the pediment here, everything is thrusting down, very self-enclosed, this weight of the architrave. It's exactly the opposite to the cathedral that breaks open space. I mean, the whole idea of the discovery of the birth of the Gothic cathedral in the 12th century was based on this idea of, well, you know what, we could sort of expand this thing to sort of encompass infinite space just by bringing in a flying buttress that'll hold the walls, and we can shoot the walls up and eliminate the walls with these huge stained glass paintings. And you're sort of blowing out the cosmos, this closed-in, dark, dank, Romanesque cavern world. That is that thrust, that passionate desire for infinite space. And the Magian, meanwhile, still to this day, in a certain sense, remains closed in within the cavern world of the horizon. Out in these deserts, the world is a gigantic dome. And Spengler comes up with this idea, it's rather unique, what he calls pseudomorphosis. And he says the early phase of the Magian culture, which begins to originate just as the Roman Empire is forming, and the Greco-Roman culture is collapsing and dying into this uninspired, very heavy, very unlyrical Roman militaristic civilization where there are no real competent artists, but there are great military tacticians, just as we have in America to a large extent. He says the first cavern really is the Pantheon, and the Pantheon isn't an Arabic building, it isn't associated with any of these religions, but it's something new, entirely unprecedented. The Greek would never have thought of this inner dome world, because this is essentially, the Pantheon is, with these columns, is essentially a building that's entirely outdoors. There really is no interior to these buildings. It's a sort of colonnade that you walk around. Whereas with respect to the domical world, and pseudomorphosis, by the way, means false formation, and Spengler has just taken it from mineralogy to mean you get a mineral, if you break